So this latest article is how the IMF and the West debt trap Zambia. Okay, Zambia is a small African nation, um, deep in debt, also very poor, but rich with resources. Zambia's debt situation has been significantly influeed by its interactions with, guess who? The International Monetary Fund and other international financial institutions, mostly Western. Debt accumulation and economic challenges. Well, Zambia's debt issues began to escalate around 2012, following advice from the IMF and the World Bank and a regional financial institutions like banks and stuff like that to borrow for infrastructure projects. They said, hey, you need this, you need bridges, you need highways, you need hospitals. They were expected to generate revenue and socioeconomic benefits. However, the anticipated returns didn't materialize as quickly as needed to meet the repayment schedules. So they borrowed money. They couldn't get the bridges, highways, and hospitals built in on time to satisfy the IMF debt that the payments that they had to make. And so it trapped them in a situation where they had to pay for something that hasn't paid off yet. Mm-hmm. Additionally, the global price of copper, a major export for Zambia, did not reach the projected highs, further straining the country's ability to service its debt. Keeping in mind, the United States and the guys on Wall Street have a pretty good ability to fluctuate the price of commodities because you have oligarchs running 90% of the stock market, as we've learned yesterday. So the situation in Zambia was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing climate crises, which severely disrupted trade, of course, globally, but particularly in Zambia, they had a really hard time with COVID when it hit. Between 2018 and 2021, debt repayments increased from 20% to 38% of the national budget, indicating shrinking fiscal space and reduced capacity to fund critical public services. So if you have to pay 38% of everything that you have to a foreign country to service a debt that one of your corrupt politicians took on, you're in between a rock and a hard place. There's not much you can do as far as education, social security, stuff like that. There's an IMF building for you. The default and IMF intervention. So in 2020, though, Zambia defaulted on its foreign debt. It was the first African country to do so during COVID. Subsequently, Zambia ended up taking a $1.3 billion loan from the IMF at that time, which came with stringent conditions. Now, they were already in debt up to their eyeballs, and they were in a tough spot. And the only person that would lend them money under these strict conditions was Western institutions, the IMF. Some of the conditions included implementing austerity measures, such as eliminating fuel subsidies, cutting electricity subsidies, raising tariffs, expanding value-added tax to more goods. So you're talking about this kind of austerity also devalues currencies to where Zambia's currency just goes in the toilet. They changed the price of copper to make it so they can't even trade their way out of this deal. And what ends up happening is American corporations or the American military or whatever comes in as a Trojan horse saying, look, you didn't pay up. We want your ports. We want your copper. We want your mines. This is a common theme on this live stream, which we talk about all the time. So the IMF argued that these measures would help reduce primary balance deficit and eventually allow for increased spending on social protection, including health services. That's just what they said. Zambia's debt restructuring efforts culminated in a $6.3 billion agreement with its creditors in June 2023. This deal, which involved rescheduling debt for more than 20 years with a 3-year grace period, was crucial for Zambia's economic recovery. So most of the time, restructuring is a big headache, and the IMF can either choose to help them or not help them. I think they call it giving it a haircut. Sometimes they'll restructure. Other times they'll say no. The agreement unlocked the disbursement of 188 million from the IMF, part of the broader 1.3 billion bailout. The restructuring was essential to get Zambia out of the precarious situation it was in. But even though they took the money, they still are in a debt cycle and debt distress. Zambia continues to face financial risks. It still gets shut out from international capital markets. The IMF's debt sustainability analysis indicated that without comprehensive debt treatment in line with program parameters, their debt would not be sustainable at all. And it all goes back to, a colonial era where all of this starts from. Because we've talked about this before, how IMF is a form of neocolonialism where they trap a country into a cycle of debt, and for that they lose some of their sovereignty. They don't get to decide what they do with their own stuff, their own resources, their own people, and it always comes at the expense of them. And like I mentioned before, it's usually the corrupt politicians, some guy in a banana republic somewhere who came to power backed by U.S. interests and stuff, says, we're going to take on all these loans because why not? We want to be capitalist and Western, and we want to play ball. It's not good. It's not good. What happens, as you can see from these slides, poverty in Zambia is still prevalent today, and it has been as far back as the colonial times. This is Zambia over 100 years ago, probably more than that, but slaves, nonetheless, we treated them as a commodity along with all of their natural resources. Mm-hmm. So it was formerly known as Northern Rhodesia, Zambia was. It was colonized by the British in the late 19th century. The primary motivation was resource extraction, particularly copper mining, which it still is today. The British South Africa Company, led by Cecil Rhodes, the great philanthropist and colonialist, sack of crap, initially administered the territory, focusing on exploiting its mineral wealth. So when it gained its independence in 1964, with Kenneth Kaunda becoming the first president, despite independence, Western influence continued through the economic ties and age relationships. So you have the continuation of the upper hand taking what it wants from a country who is just barely coming onto its feet. So Zambia's economy remained heavily reliant on copper throughout the years, and Western countries being major trading partners, they took advantage of that. Western powers also sought to maintain influence in Zambia as part of their broader strategy to counter Soviet influence in Africa. Western countries and institutions like the World Bank debt trapping Zambia clearly is the majority of the issue when it comes to them running with weights around their ankles. It's hard for them to pay the debt because, as I've mentioned before, they take on high interest loans to pay off the low interest loans and vice versa. So in the 70s, though, they saw a decline in copper prices. It led to a crash, and this paved the way for more Western intervention through these investment and kind of development programs. And so by the 80s and 90s, you have the IMF and the World Bank doing all the structural adjustment programs on Zambia and requiring them without any negotiation total economic liberalization and privatization. So they get to come in, take state-owned assets, give them to the corporations, just turn them right over. Not only that, the political influence that the West has, as you know, Mike, they're pretty prevalent and good at getting opposition parties funded and supercharging, regime change when they need to. Mm-hmm. Western countries pressured Kayunda's one-party state to allow multi-party state elections in 1991. See, that's where they're spreading the democracy, so that's the first way in the door for American hegemony, is to say, you should do democracy because it's the right moral thing to do. And if you don't, you're a dictator, and we'll convince our people to go and take over your country and kick you out. And in this case, they do it in a nice way. They say, you should really have multi-party state elections. And he goes, okay, I'll do it. Western donors have often tied aid to political and economic reforms influencing Zambian government. So you have many NGOs, think tanks, policy institutes, foreign aid development, whatever. A lot of the time is that way. Did you know, Mike, that in Cuba, the USAID, do you know what that is? It's the United States Aid and Development. It's a branch of the CIA when it comes to going into places. They say, we're going to develop you. It's going to be great. That this branch of the government actually set up a kind of a fake Cuban Twitter where they got people to go on there and get Cubans on there and then stoke anti-communist propaganda. That happened. The USAID also started a Cuban hip-hop band, like a group where everybody got together and did hip-hop dancing, and they secretly were pushing anti-communist messages through that. And the other thing was there was a fake HIV program that the USAID started in Cuba in order to harvest the data of the people of Cuba. So
nice.
Little hip tip there. Yeah. So back to Zambia. Now, in the 90s, under pressure from the West, Zambia privatized its copper mines, with many being acquired by Western companies. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the problem. How you can't say colonialism or slavery or capitalism is ethical or whatever. It's clearly wrong. It's clearly theft. The one thing that they told us not to do as children. Environmental and labor concerns. Western mining operations have faced criticism for their environmental damage and labor practices. So obviously the mining industry is fraught with abuse since its very inception. Coal miners constantly getting stuck in coal mines and working long hours and not having good benefits. And when they strike, they would come and massacre them. The environmental implications of mining, forget about it. It's a terrible, terrible thing to do to the earth. But Zambia, it has sought to diversify its international relationships. So with the rise of China as a economic powerhouse, but Western countries and institutions still are trying to be the primary force in Zambia. IMF still continues to this day to be one of the key players in Zambia's ongoing debt restructuring and sovereignty issues. Western countries continue to support democratic institutions and civil society in Zambia, so they still want to have Zambia be a shining beacon of democratic blah, blah, blah in that region, when this really just means they want that having a democratic government gives American hegemony a foot in the door. Remember that, kids. So Zambia is a poor place, okay? There's a lot of poverty going on in this country. 47% of Zambia's population is multidimensionally poor. 23% of all Zambians, which is about 4.6 million people, are vulnerable to that same poverty. The intensity of deprivations among the poor in Zambia is about 48%. More than half of Zambia's population lives on less than $1.90 USD a day, which is below the poverty line, which the poverty line is not even a good metric to judge by.
That's another good part of Jason Hickel's work.
Yeah, and shout out to Jason Hickel for doing such excellent work. 82% of Zambia's poor population lives in rural areas. So, again, this is a country that could use a good rural infrastructure project. It's really easy. China has made great strides to, create infrastructure in their rural areas because that's the real decider of poverty, is sort of these access to electricity and roads and things like this. So, that's a big hurdle in Zambia. And 31% of children under 5 in Zambia are at risk of stunting. So that means that they don't grow like they should because of malnutrition, poverty, lack of medicine, lack of food, stuff like this. So we had every opportunity to keep them under our wing and do something great, but we extracted the resources of the country and left them as poor as they were when they started.